Hi, I'm Megan Finnerty, and I am so excited to welcome you to tonight's Storytellers Project show. I'm with the USA Today Network, and I'm the founder and director of the Storytellers Project. And tonight's show is dedicated to stories about stories. This evening, you'll hear from some of our network's Pulitzer Prize winning journalists and editors about the ways their stories changed them or changed our communities. I promise you it'll be interesting. We're not here to like be nerdy or brag about ourselves. Instead, what we're here to do is help you understand like this is why we do what we do, or how it affects our everyday communities, or sometimes how it affects entire nation or the entire nation. So we are excited, and I want you to meet our journalists right now. I'm going to bring them up, and they're all going to wave at you a little bit awkwardly from their houses. Peter Badia is the executive editor of the Detroit Free Press. ML Elric is an investigative reporter at the Detroit Free Press. Daniel Gonzalez is an investigative reporter, and he covers immigration and the border at the Arizona Republic. Terry DeMio is the heroin epidemic reporter, and she's an investigations and enterprise reporter at the Cincinnati Enquirer. Joe Sanka is an investigative reporter at the Louisville Courier-Journal. And we'll also hear on our show this evening from Christy Go. She's a national editor at USA Today. Hi, thank you guys so much for being here tonight. Oh, Jim Schaefer, I'm sorry, I left you out. Jim Schaefer's, oh my God, I'm mortified. That's it, the show's, well, ladies and gentlemen, I won't see you again. Jim Schaefer is an investigative reporter at the Detroit Free Press. Sorry about that, Jim. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Since 2016, if you've been paying attention at home, the Storytellers Project has brought more than 100 shows each year to communities across the country. But we've canceled our in-person season as part of our network's response to the coronavirus. And we know it feels unsafe to be together in like big enclosed spaces, breathing on each other with hundreds of strangers. It does feel necessary to be together online. So that's what we're here to do. Tonight is not a TED Talk. It's not Toastmasters. It's not a how-to. It's not an inspirational talk. And I swear to God, the only thing we'll try to sell you is probably a subscription. Instead, we're here to visit with each other. We want you to open your hearts and receive these stories in the spirit in which they're intended, because that's how community connecting really happens. We know that these stories are going to be some conversational and casual, I promise you. Others are going to be really polished and professional. We want you to know that this is how these people really are. We've only workshopped through the narrative arc, not their personal delivery, because we believe personal presentation is a huge part of storytelling. All right, with that, I'm going to leave you with one last thought. We believe that creating empathy and understanding is vital at all times. Like that's literally what the entire USA Today network is doing all the time. There are 260 newsrooms in our network now, because we merged with Gatehouse. We're a really big company now. And all of our journalists, there's more than 5,000 of us, are dedicated to serving and reflecting our communities. Tonight, I'm inviting you to get to know just a tiny handful of them, but I hope that you leave this show knowing that we have people in all these communities working hard for people like you, or maybe actually you. So with that, let's get into the show. I'm excited to bring up Jim, who I forgot, and his partner, ML. They have a story about a uniquely Detroit scandal. Take it away, gentlemen.
Hey kids, my name is ML Elric, and I'm here to tell you a story. I'm going to take you back to the magical year of 2002 when texts were mysterious messages that were sent through exotic little devices. That's when a man who loved to bury the truth ran into two men who loved to dig out the truth. The first man's name is Kwame Kilpatrick, and he just became the mayor of Detroit. At first, I thought he would be the best mayor of my lifetime, and I almost gave up journalism to take a job with him. But I stayed at the newspaper and became fascinated watching him constantly fiddling with this little device. No matter where he went, he seemed to be playing a handheld video game. When his aides told me it was a BlackBerry and he was texting, I just had to know what they were talking about. So I filed a Freedom of Information request to see what he was writing that was so important. The city said they didn't have the messages, and remember, I still thought this guy was pretty cool, so I went on to other things. But before too long, my bosses found out that I'd looked into a rumor that there was a wild party at the mayor's mayoral mansion. I didn't believe it, but they thought it might be true, so they decided to get me digging some more, and then they brought in a big gun.
Thanks, Mike. So I got paired up with Mike, and we went chasing after this rumor about a nude wild party at the Manoogian Mansion. We spent 3 weeks on it. We weren't able to prove it. To this day, that party hasn't been proven. But when you work on something for 3 weeks, editors look at you and say, well, what do you have? And so we said, well, we noticed the mayor has a lot of bodyguards, and they're all police officers, and they work full time for him. And in Detroit at the time, still to a certain degree today, if you called 911, they'd take a while to show up. Sometimes they don't show up, or they show up the next day. So having cops dedicated to watching the mayor was a big deal. So we wrote a story. The headline was "Watching Kilpatrick is a full-time job for 20 cops. Other major cities assign fewer." After that story broke, we started getting flooded with tips. And over the next few years, we wrote other headlines. Kilpatrick expenses exposed. Top Kilpatrick police bodyguard took star to illegal club. Police kept watch as Queen Latifah partied. Kilpatrick stocks city payroll with friends and family. And then mayor too wild for DC cops. During this time, we also tried to get the text messages again. There was a lawsuit that was filed, and the plaintiff's attorney in that case thought he might be able to subpoena the mayor's text messages. We thought that would be pretty cool, so we stayed on top of that. But in the end, the city sent a lawyer to this company that had the text messages and threatened them. If you release these things, there's going to be big problems. So we didn't get the texts. And the stories we'd done up to that point, well, we thought they'd had very little impact, frankly, even though we thought they were great journalism. The mayor and his family called them misinformation and said we were on a witch hunt. We were fake news before fake news.
But the mayor thought the stories had some impact because when he announced his reelection campaign, it was with a radio commercial in which he began with an apology. No one had ever done that before in Detroit, and we had pretty much counted him out. But at the very last minute, he pulled off a miracle and he was reelected. Now, my bosses thought the mayor had learned from his brush with death and they wanted to assign me to do something else. Well, I wanted to stay on this story, so I had to quit the paper to go literally across the street to a TV station who said they cared about the mayor more than anything else. So I thought I was home free. Well, the mayor didn't agree, and within 4 months, he had sent a team over to the TV station, and there had been an agreement made that I would not cover the mayor anymore. Now, nobody had the good manners to tell me that, so I kind of just went the next 18 months getting stories killed and wondering if I knew what the hell I was doing, if I was any good at this business. And eventually I went back to the Free Press, but I was not the same guy who left. I went back with a broken heart and no confidence.
I was off doing other things at that time too, not covering the mayor. I was covering criminal justice issues. But there was a trial coming up. That lawsuit that I mentioned was finally going to be heard in court. This was a case where 2 police officers had sued the mayor, saying that he had ruined their careers because they were getting involved in investigations that might expose that Kwame Kilpatrick was cheating on his wife and indeed philandering with lots of different women. So I grabbed Mike and we planned to cover this trial coming up. We also learned that we might actually see the text messages during this trial because this attorney was persistent and convinced the judge over the years that they were relevant to the trial. And so the judge said, okay, go ahead and subpoena them, but they're coming directly to me and I will keep them secret. And if I see anything that contradicts what is testified to in this trial, you can use them to basically contradict the witnesses. So Kwame Kilpatrick takes the stand. One of the biggest questions he's asked by the plaintiff's attorney is, did you and your chief of staff, a woman named Christine Beatty, have a romantic relationship? He was indignant, flat out denied it. His testimony was a lecture about how even the very question is unfair and insulting to successful women who succeed every year and every day. We thought it was a masterful performance and very convincing for the jury.
So by now, this guy who I really liked, I mean, there was a time I was praying for his success. I'm now praying that we finally get some justice in this town. And the lawyer for the whistleblowers turns to the judge and says, Your Honor, what'd you think? The judge is kind of confused. And so the lawyer says, remember, you're going to look at those text messages. And if you heard a lie in the witness stand, you know, you're going to let them all come out. And the judge just says, what texts? So the whistleblower's lawyer was pretty confident that he had made his case, and he begins his closing arguments. Turns out the jury did not buy the mayor's bravura performance on the witness stand like the rest of us did. They just thought it was another politician saying pretty words, and they slammed him. But Jim and I were not happy. We felt like hope had died. It seemed like these text messages we've been trying for 5 or 6 years to get were going to be gone forever.
And then one night I got a phone call. And then I was called to a meeting in a restaurant. I didn't tell anybody about it because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. It was very mysterious. And at this meeting, I'm sitting at a table and the text messages are slid across the table to me. They were printed out on stacks of paper about that high. And my reaction after looking at them, frankly, was holy shit. I couldn't believe it. Here they were after all these years of trying to get them, and they were right in front of me. So I called Mike and our editor, dashed back to the newsroom, and pulled them into, they had no idea that I had done this, pulled them into a meeting room. And I said, gentlemen, I think we just hit the mud load.
So I'm in the pit of despair, and Jim throws this lifeline down there. So I have to go out to one of our suburban offices. He's sitting on the top floor of this sterile insurance building. I'm going up the elevator. When what does he got? What does he got? What does he got? I get in the office, and it's Jim, a desk, and a stack of papers. And I'm like, what's in them? Is this good? He's like, take a look. And I said, just, tease me a little bit. Give me a little taste. He says, take a look. So I do. Top page is a reference to love. And I'm like, okay, but these are high school friends, the mayor and his chief of staff. So they could love each other, in the way I love Jim as a colleague. Second page, pretty boring. Third page, I see something where I think that's a little salty. And by the time we get through this stack of messages, we have found messages that say things like, I've been dreaming all day about having you to myself for 3 days, relaxing, laughing, talking, sleeping, and making love. Bingo. But my exhilaration was pretty short-lived because I still wasn't confident that my bosses would publish the story. And if they wouldn't, I'd have to quit. And by now I'm running out of places to work in Detroit. But there was still this tingle. And I turned to Jim and I said, this could be our Pulitzer here.
Which I did not want to hear.
No, he didn't want to.
Because I'm superstitious and I didn't want to jinx anything, but I also didn't want people to think that's why we were doing this story. It wasn't about winning an award. That's nice, but that wasn't why we did it. So we get called to a meeting with our bosses. And as far as we knew, they didn't know about this yet. So we're like, uh-oh, what's coming here? Are we in trouble? Because we had pushed some things. We had made a deal with a source without running it up the chain. They were the last ones to know that what we had here, and that's a pretty big no-no. So we go up to the upper floors of the Detroit Free Press to the editor's office, and he's in there. The managing editor is there, the deputy managing editor, and then our editor, and then me and Mike. And we sit down on some couches, and the managing editor kind of leans in and he says, what you guys just did, don't ever do that again. And then he goes, but this is a hell of a story.
And it was a hell of a story. And it took us a couple months to get it ready to publish. And, we still didn't know when we published it, were people going to care? We'd done so many stories that hadn't taken the mayor out, not because we want him to be out, but because he'd broken the law. But it's publication night. We're buttoning things up. I live in the city of Detroit. The mayor's still powerful. He runs the police department. So I send my family away just in case. Jim and I are very confident we've got the goods, but we're still nervous. Good reporters are always nervous. We'd put it all on the line, our careers, the paper's credibility, and we never forgot that when you fight the king, you've got to kill the king. But then the king did something that was so wonderful. He released a statement that said the texts were profoundly embarrassing and reflect a very difficult period in my life. Then as an added bonus, he put his family on a private jet and got the hell out of town. And finally, Jim and I looked like we might get a decent night's sleep.
Yeah, I think we did, although we were up pretty early. But still, we weren't expecting much. The stories that we had done over the years, we thought were pretty damn good stories, but they hadn't had any real impact. And we knew this was a great story, but still, was it going to hit with a thud on people's doorsteps and we would all move on like we had in the past? But I'll tell you what, the next morning, it was like a bombshell. Everybody was talking about this story. We were hearing from reporters all over who were telling us this journalism was a great lift for them during a really rough period for newspapers. That's when, yearly layoffs were becoming a regular thing in our business. So fast forward 2 months, we're summoned over with every other reporter in town to the prosecutor's office, to the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice. We don't know what to expect. We knew they'd done an independent investigation based on our story. And we go up to the top floor. It's elbow to elbow in there, just absolutely packed. And I sit down with my laptop because I got to write a story because it's breaking news. And prosecutor standing at a podium. And she starts reading off felony after felony after felony, charging the mayor of Detroit and his chief of staff. My hands were shaking. I couldn't even type. I just couldn't believe our journalism had this kind of impact.
So we were gratified that finally someone cared. But the mayor didn't care. He proclaimed his innocence. He told Detroiters, "I would never quit on you." And then he quit on them. His last words as mayor were delivered from the mayor's conference room. He told Detroiters and anybody listening, "You done set me up for a comeback."
Yeah, but first he had to go to jail. He pleaded guilty to 2 felonies, got 120 days in jail. And really, that could have been the end of it.
But it turns out some other law enforcement types were paying attention. The feds had been reading our stuff all along, and they finally charged him. And when we saw the indictment, we started thinking, well, maybe somebody should charge the feds with plagiarism, because they've basically taken what we wrote and put it in the indictment. But we weren't complaining.
So there was a 6-month trial, covered every day of it. And the mayor of Detroit was ultimately convicted along with some other folks. 24 counts, things like extortion, bribery, tax evasion, racketeering, and conspiracy.
For all his sins, the mayor got 28 years in prison. It's one of the longest public corruption sentences in U.S. history.
And today, Kwame Kilpatrick is maintaining he's an innocent man. But the people who read the Detroit Free Press know the truth. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for your journalism. And thank you for your senses of humor, which also sounds like a prerequisite to be a journalist in Detroit.
It helps.
No, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you being on our show tonight. Now is the time in our show when we like to thank our national sponsor, Humana. If you're a regular follower of the show, you know that they sponsor our shows in real life in the outside times, but they have stuck with us virtually, and we really appreciate it because they believe that telling stories is incredibly important. They believe telling stories makes people healthier as individuals and as entire communities, and that the connections we make through storytelling are so powerful. And we need these connections. You guys know this, like right now with coronavirus, but also all the time. Humana is committed to the health and safety and well-being of the people and the community they serve. And this is really true. I'm not just saying that. If you want to find out for yourself, you can go to humana.com. They have tons of information on how you can stay emotionally connected and emotionally and physically healthy during these times. So thanks, Humana, for being there for us and for everyone else. It is now a joy to bring up our next storyteller, Terry DeMio. She's coming to us from the Cincinnati Enquirer, and Terry has a story about a project she worked on that changed an entire community. Take it away, Terry.
Thank you. I became immersed in the world of heroin in 2012 when I made my way back to the Cincinnati Enquirer as a general assignment reporter. And I noticed an inordinate number of people dying from heroin overdose. And at that time, there were no buildings to go into to find out more information about this disorder. So I went to grieving families, moms mostly. And I followed them as they begged for help from state and local governments, from health departments, even from medical doctors, most of whom were doing nothing to help them. But I wasn't new to heroin. I was very close to someone for most of my life who had, as an adult, acquired this heroin addiction disorder. As a child, she had a full, loving family. She was always an honor student from elementary through college. She was very talented and beautiful, but mostly she was a kind and wonderful person. But she became addicted to heroin. Now, after a time, she got help from methadone, which at that time was the only medication-assisted treatment available. And it did the job. She was stabilized. But then she decided to move to a rural area. There was no methadone clinic there. And something you may or may not know about heroin use is that it can make the brain confused, and it can mess up the ability for the brain to appropriately produce dopamine. And I don't know if that's what happened to my person, but she did indeed fall into a severe depression. It wasn't long before she died by suicide. She had no drugs in her system, no illicit drugs, no medication either. I know this because I'm a reporter. I got the coroner's autopsy report. So let's fast forward to 2017 and the Cincinnati Enquirer. I had been working full-time as what we called our heroin reporter for about a year at the direction of Peter Bhatia, who was our editor at the time. And it was just a crazy period. People were dropping all over the place, it felt. In groups, individually, people were overdosing, and fentanyl had set in, and also carfentanil, which we all know now is a large animal opioid. And at the time, when I learned that from a researcher, I dubbed it the elephant opioid, because I said big like a dog, and he said big like an elephant. And one of our editors said, we've got to do something big with heroin this year. So I went to Amy Wilson, our storytelling coach, and I told her about a story idea that Carrie Cochran, who had been a videographer and photographer at the time with us, and Dan Horn, great writer and storyteller and fellow reporter, and I had all had for some time to try to cover this thing 24/7. Try to show people what this really looked like around the clock. Amy brought it to Peter. Peter said yes, and everybody was on board. I couldn't have been more stunned nor touched. And that's why the week of July 10th, 65 reporters and photographers headed out onto the streets, under bridges, where people were using heroin, where people were overdosing from fentanyl or heroin, to observing people who were grieving and young children who had been removed from parents who had the disorder and did not have care. We went everywhere, and there was a team of people that tried to count everything that was going on: number of overdoses, number of overdose deaths, number of babies born to moms who either had heroin addiction or previously had one. We wanted to show what this epidemic looked like 24/7. On Wednesday, my photo partner, Liz Dufour, and I went to McMicken Avenue in Cincinnati. And we were pretty sure what we would find. And where we were, we met Allie. Allie was at the time a 25-year-old human trafficking victim who had become addicted to fentanyl. It was hot, it was humid. She was wearing a very little purple dress, and she had her hair all done. And she looked beautiful, but she also looked tragic. She was way too thin, and she was sick from withdrawal. In fact, she told me, I just might throw up on the sidewalk right here. She did not. She kept pulling her hair up like this and dropping it down. And every time she pulled it up, it exposed these big purple bruises on her neck, a darker purple than her dress. And I knew that Allie had been injecting in her neck, probably because her veins had collapsed. And she told Liz and I that she was doing fentanyl about every 2 hours at this point. Suddenly she darted across the street, disappeared for a few seconds. Turns out she had purchased some fentanyl, and she went behind some trash cans and tried to hide while she used it. We saw Allie again months later. She was in a jail recovery pod, which she went to by choice. And she had gained some weight. I almost didn't recognize her. She had color in her cheeks and this little sweet smile. And she hugged Liz and she hugged me and she said she was better. And after this, upon her release, Allie was going to go home. Her mother hadn't seen her in years. Well, that never happened. Allie went back to the streets, probably back to her dope boy, as she called him, and Allie is in the wind. On Thursday of Heroin Week, as we started to call it, Ann Saker, our health reporter, and Kara Osley, our photo director, went to a clinic that was for babies who had had neonatal abstinence syndrome. And there they met Eliana, who is this beautiful, perfectly healthy, bright little girl, and her mother, Stephanie, who was holding her and kissing her and blowing raspberries on her tummy and smiling and talking about their future together. 14 days later, I believe it was, Anne got a phone call. We sit next to each other in cubicles, but there's a wall between us. But I heard her pick up the phone, I heard her say a few things, and I heard this pause. And then I heard Anne's voice crack. And I just knew it. Anne was being told that Stephanie had died from a heroin overdose just 10 days after Anne and Kara had met her and Eliana. Kara walked over, tears sprung into her eyes immediately, but I didn't cry. I knew something like this was very likely to happen between the time that we gathered and the time that we published. I know and knew then that this kind of addiction, all addiction, is a chronic disorder that needs attention, needs to be treated, and people need help, often for a lifetime. And it's why I carry Narcan. Because even though I am a reporter, I observe, I take notes, I investigate, I ask questions. I am not an activist carrying signs or an advocate or anything like that. But I will not let somebody die in front of me needlessly when I know I can restore their breath with Narcan and call 911. So 7 Days of Heroin, as it turned out in 2018, won the Pulitzer Prize for local reporting, and we were stunned. We knew we had informed our community. We hoped people were watching the video and reading the story, but it was just astonishing and exciting to win. And people were throwing hugs around, and maybe some champagne got popped open. But I felt something else too. I felt relief. I felt relief because finally I knew that there were so many people who could see this opioid epidemic the way I had for years, who could see it day in and day out and see its devastation on everybody. 7 Days of Heroin did not solve the epidemic. In fact, this year, 37 states already have reported that they have seen more overdose deaths year to date than any year prior. And it is devastating. But you know what? I have hope. And here's why. Because heroin addiction and most addictions had been like the ugly stepchild of medical care, the dirty secret that people hid. It wasn't addressed by medical people very often. It was more likely to be addressed by criminal justice, if you can call it that. But now, and in 5 or 6 years after I started reporting this, our community is getting better. I know this because I see needle exchanges now, trying to save people from HIV and hepatitis C and trying to get what would have been discarded needles on the street into safe places so these bloodborne infections don't spread. I see jails with recovery pods that do offer the best practices treatment, medication, assisted treatment. I see some people not having to go to jail at all for using fentanyl or heroin. Depending on circumstances, they may be directed into care. I've seen so many outpatient clinics that provide medication-assisted treatment pop up all over the place, including in rural areas. And tens of thousands of people in greater Cincinnati alone apparently are thinking that they won't needlessly or watch somebody needlessly die from heroin. They won't walk past someone who may be overdosing. And the reason I know that is because in greater Cincinnati alone, tens of thousands of people now carry Narcan, just like me. Thank you.
Terry, thank you so much for your journalism and for your compassion.
Thank you, Megan.
Well, it is a blessing and a joy to have you on the show. And I know your story was hard to report. It's hard to tell. It is heartbreaking to listen to, but your empathy is a real model for all of us. And I really appreciate that tonight.
I so appreciate having been asked. Thanks, Megan.
You're welcome. Well, everyone, I'm going to need you to take a big deep breath with me because we are going to switch gears. That Terry story it's intense and it's heavy because what sometimes we have to cover and talk about in the real world, right, is a lot. And so with that, I'm going to bring up one of our colleagues, Kristen Go. She's a national editor with the USA Today Network because we want to pull back the curtain just a tiny bit to help you learn. Hi, Kristen. To help you learn a tiny bit more about how we do what we do. We're not going to slow down the pace. Kristen and I are going to keep it moving, but we do want to help you guys understand, like, how do we get this done if we have 260 newsrooms and more than 5,000 reporters? So, Kristen, you just get a lot of phone calls, right? You just talk to. No, I'm kidding. Right. Okay, sorry, I was going to ask a question. So tell me, but do explain, like, kind of what is the promise of our network?
Yeah, the promise of our network is that we are able to tell stories in a very authentic way. We live in the communities that we cover. We have, like you said, we have 260 properties across the nation. That means we're in almost every single state in the country. And we're not just parachuting in, which is what I think you hear as a criticism of other national organizations. We are there, we are the eyes and ears of the community, and we can surface stories at the local level because we see different trends. We will often hear stories that may be happening in Louisville or Detroit, or Lafayette, Louisiana, and we can see, hey, this is happening nationwide. We need to pull these strings together to tell a more comprehensive story of not just one community, but in communities across the country. And that was part of the reason why I was hired 2 years ago, actually, to help really bring to light working as one newsroom, even though we're 260 different properties, but really working together to create one vision to tell the best stories possible.
Well, Kristen, thank you for that. I want to point out, you were recently talking about Lafayette in particular and our colleagues throughout Louisiana. Can you tell us briefly how those newsrooms came together to cover the recent hurricanes?
Yeah. The hurricanes happened the same week that we were having 600 fires erupt in California. Mm-hmm. It was an incredibly crazy time. And it really necessitated a lot of coordination because a lot of our newsrooms in Louisiana are small, and also Texas. This was, we were following the path of the storm. We initially thought it was going to hit Florida, then it shifted to Louisiana and Texas. And so we started gathering together and coordinating calls twice a day to look at, okay, what does the path look like? How are we prepared to cover this? And because we have smaller newsrooms in in that part of the country, we knew that we needed to help out. We already had a team in Louisiana that was reporting another story, and so they volunteered to stay to help. We also have what's called a digital optimization team. They were helping to provide really 24/7 coverage all the way before landfall, through landfall, and then in the aftermath, so that the people who were there could evacuate, they could get out safely, our reporters could continue to report and also take breaks, because we, when we are able to take breaks as reporters, we can do our jobs better. And that's how we are really able to support our local newsrooms.
Kristen, I really appreciate that kind of view into how we are able to network everyone together. I have one more tiny quick question for you. One of the things you talked about, or we talk about as a big company, is that we are also investing in these newsrooms. And so can you talk to us about how we show up and we try to not just take their news, but try to offer them resources as well to support their communities?
Yeah, the Hurricane Laura is the perfect example. Like I said, we had a team that was there in Louisiana for another story, and they said, hey, we're going to stay, we're going to help you out. And the person who was organizing where all the crews were was Bro Crypt, who was working at the Montgomery newsroom because they were out of the eye of the storm. And he said, hey, Kristen, where do you want to send your crews? And I said, you guys know the area better. You tell me where you need them. And it turns out that they ended up going to Lake Cameron, which was one of the hardest hit areas, and did a story about fishermen who had gone to Lake Cameron as they had with Hurricane Ike and Hurricane Rita, and they sat it out safely there. And this time around, 10 of the 15 fishermen lost their boats. They sunk.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a story that we were able to tell. It ran in USA Today, it ran in all the local properties, and readers across the nation were able to react to say, how can we help? And so that's just one way in which we work together seamlessly to try to tell the most impactful stories.
Kristen, I really appreciate you joining us on the show. So thank you so much for coming tonight to talk a little bit about your responsibilities.
Thank you.
Thank you. To everyone watching, we appreciate you doing that, because we're incredibly passionate about the journalism we do. We do it for our communities, all 260 of them, because we believe, again, in serving and reflecting our communities, and often developing empathy and understanding within them. It's not just the facts, it's the people and the why behind the facts. So thanks for indulging our tiny little, our little PSA in the middle of the show. I'd like to get right to it with Daniel Gonzalez. He's one of our colleagues at the Arizona Republic, and he has a story that is unlike any other story you'll probably ever hear. Daniel, you have an incredibly interesting perspective and a rare experience that we invite you to share.
Thank you. So I took one look at this woman's clothing and I knew there could be a problem. She was wearing a white blouse with pinstripes, some tight blue jeans, and a pair of canvas sneakers. She looked like she was ready for a trip to the shopping mall, not a trek into the desert. It was June 2017, and we were accompanying a search for a missing migrant. And it was myself and our videographer, David Wallace, and our photographer, Nick Oza. And we were there as part of this project that we were doing to explore what would be the consequences of President Trump's campaign promise to build a wall along the entire US-Mexico border, all 2,000 miles of it. And the woman who looked like she was ready to go shopping, her name was Celine, and the missing migrant was her brother, Carlos Martinez, who was 25 years old. Now, Celine was born in the United States, so she was a US citizen, but her brother had been born in Mexico and had been brought to the United States when he was just 9 months old. And he had lived his entire life in Phoenix. But recently he had been deported for an infraction he had committed when he was a teenager. And now he was trying to get back to his family. But since he had never been able to legalize his status, he had decided to cross the border illegally and cross through the desert. Now, this part of the desert is in southwestern Arizona, and there is a highway that runs along on the Mexican side of the border. And what smugglers will do is they'll pick up migrants in the town of Sasabe, which is on the border, and they'll drive them about 20 miles west, and they'll drop them off in the middle of the desert. Now, what the migrants are trying to do is cross the border illegally and get to the town, this town in Arizona called Ajo. And then from Ajo, there are smugglers waiting for them, and they'll drive them to Phoenix and then to their final destination. Now, in that part of the border, all that's there are some rusted railroad ties that were set up years ago, mostly to block vehicles from getting across the border. They're very easy to get across. You can either just climb over them or underneath them. Now, it might seem, well, this seems like a very easy thing to do to get across, enter the United States illegally. But the reality is there's about 70 miles from the border to the town of Ajo. And what smugglers are trying to do is walk up this ravine between mountains to get there. And this, you have to picture, is one of the most remote and desolate places in the United States, if not the world. It's a place where the temperature in the summer can easily soar up to 120 degrees. As far as you can see is just a sea of desert. On the US side is the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. And it's just filled with vicious cactuses. These are cactuses with thorns that can shred your clothing like tissue paper, and they can poke a hole in the sole of your shoe like a nail through butter. Now, we had driven about 2 hours into the heart of the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, and we had parked our car next to what's called a rescue beacon. And these are like metal poles with a shiny object on the top that spins. And they are put there in the middle of the desert in case migrants do get into distress. They can push a button and be rescued. And we decided to park our car there because we knew that when we were coming back, it would be easier to find it. So we started hiking into the desert to the area where the missing migrant had last been seen. And right away, I could see that Celine was going to have a difficult time. She was out of shape and she was breathing heavily and she had to keep stopping to rest. But we kept going and we finally reached the area where the migrant's body had been seen, the area that we were going to search for these remains. And so we were searching, and the Celine had this, I remember her eyes were like a laser focus. She was just absolutely determined to find her brother. And she told us that not knowing what had happened to him and knowing that maybe his remains were out there somewhere was almost worse than knowing that he had died. So we found ourselves kind of participating in this search too, because we wanted to see if we could find the body. We wanted to see if we could help bring some closure to Celine. But we also knew, and I knew, that if we did find the body, it was almost something we were dreading because we knew it could be really horrible. And the reason we knew it was horrible is just a week before we had gone to the morgue in Tucson where the remains of dead migrants had been found, are brought. And on that day that we were there were the bodies of about 116 migrants being stored in this refrigerated cooler. And a lot of those migrants still hadn't been identified. They didn't know who they were. And while we were there that day, they happened to bring in on these stretchers the bodies of 2 migrants that had been found earlier that day. And I'll never forget what a horrible scene it was. One of the migrants, he didn't have a shirt on, he was wearing jeans, and the medical examiner went through his pockets and he found these little pictures that he had been carrying. And one of the pictures was obviously of his wife. And then there were 4 tiny little pictures, one for each one of his children. And I remember that his skin was just charred black. And it looked like he had been in a horrible fire. And that's what the sun had done from his body being baking out in the Arizona desert. And I'll also never forget the horrible stench that was in that room. It was like acid in our noses, and I remember how it really clung to our clothes. So anyway, we continued to search with Celine, and a couple of hours went by, and we came across this rocky outcropping, and we started seeing the telltale signs of a migrant that had gone into distress and possibly had died. And what happens is when humans start to get heat stroke, their body temperature will soar, and they'll start out of desperation ripping off whatever clothes that they have on. And we saw like a sock here and a backpack there and some underwear and a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. And then all of a sudden Celine bent down and she picked up this single white sneaker that was laying there. And she started looking at it. We were holding our breath, wondering, was this clothing belong to her brother? And could his body possibly be around there somewhere? And she looked at it carefully, and then she looked up at us and she said, no, this is not something that belonged to my brother. So by then, it was starting to get really, really hot. It was the middle of the day. We'd already been searching for several hours, and we knew we had like an hour to 2 hour hike back to our car. So we decided it was best to call off the search. So we started going back, and we got to the car. And by the time we got to the car, Celine was really in bad shape. Her head was pounding. She had a horrible headache. She was dizzy. She was faint. She had stopped sweating. So we got her inside of the car, and we cranked up the air conditioning as high as it would go. And we gave her some ice water that we had stored and some salty snacks and some ibuprofen. And after about a half an hour, she started feeling better, to our relief. So we ended up, after that, driving back to Phoenix. Now, about a month later, I got a text message from Celine, and it said that some migrants had come across a body in the desert, and they had carried it all the way back into Mexico and left it there. And now the Mexican authorities were conducting DNA tests to see if that body belonged to Celine's brother. But they told her it was going to take a while for those tests to get the results back from the test. Now, it's been about 3 years since that search happened, and the border wall is back in the news again. President Trump is campaigning for president, and he's boasting on the campaign trail that his administration has built about 300 miles of additional fencing. And this new fencing that's going up along the border is about 30 feet high. And some of that fencing is being built in the exact spot where Celine's brother crossed. So now it's much more difficult to cross in that area. Now, some people might say, well, the fence is working. It's saving lives because people can't cross there anymore. But the reality is a lot more complex, because a fence and a wall is not a silver bullet. It's not a panacea, because the reality is a lot more difficult. The reality is that the wall doesn't address the root causes of migration. It doesn't address the extreme poverty that exists in Mexico and other countries in Latin America, the corruption, the cartel violence, the insecurity, the things that drive people to migrate, to leave their homes. And it also doesn't address the opportunities that exist in our country, and the jobs that many Americans no longer want to do, like the farm workers who pick our food, or the people who cook our food in restaurants, or the people who clean our toilets in hotel rooms. And it also doesn't address our broken immigration system that often forces people to come illegally rather than legally. Now, in 2018, our project called The Wall won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the reporters, the journalists who got to go to New York to receive the award. And standing on the stage at Columbia University was one of the highlights of my journalism career. But that's not why we do this work. We don't do this work to win awards. We do this work to explain to the public what the consequences are of building a border wall. And here's what some of those consequences are. The statistics show that in the last 20 years, around 11,000 migrants have died in the desert. More than 3,000 of those migrants have died in Arizona alone. And just this year, the bodies of 120 migrants have been found. And what that suggests is that migrants are being pushed to cross in ever more risky and deadly areas. Now, Celine's brother his goal was to come back to Phoenix. And about 2 months after I got that first text message from Celine, that's about how long it took for those DNA tests to come back. And those DNA tests ended up verifying that those remains that were found were indeed Celine's brother. And his goal was to come back to Phoenix one day and be reunited with his family. But that never happened. And what ended up happening was that Celine brought his ashes back to Phoenix in a wooden box. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much for your story. Thank you for your reporting. Thank you for your sensitivity.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh man, I appreciate your story. We appreciate your work. To our audience, I know these stories are heavy and they're a lot to hear. And one of the things that we really appreciate your attention tonight. It takes a lot to receive these stories, but we believe that it's important to bear witness to these narratives. I hope you can hear that our colleagues feel that same way too, and that they bring their whole selves to this job. When Daniel was out there reporting with Celine, I mean, certainly he was concerned for her personally, but he was also concerned about telling her story appropriately. So tonight, we appreciate the sensitivity and thoughtfulness represented by all of our colleagues. But to you, our viewers, we appreciate your sensitivity and your willingness to receive these narratives. We're going to take a big, deep breath because we have kind of a hard emotional shift. Our next storyteller is Peter Badia. Peter's an editor in Detroit, but he's also kind of low-key famous, okay, super famous in the journalism world for having worked on so many projects that resulted in Pulitzer Prizes. And so Peter is here not as a man whose like name is exactly on a bunch of Pulitzer Prize winning things, but who is sort of the man behind the scenes who helped bring all that together. So Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Megan. And good evening, everyone. It's hard to follow Daniel's story and Terry's story. So powerful, so moving, and so worthy of the awards they received. I'm going to tell you a couple of little different kinds of stories. So sometime in 1977, a memo landed on my desk at the Oregonian in Portland, proposing a project that would use French fries as a metaphor to explain the complex and deteriorating relationship between the economies of Asia and the Pacific Northwest. The memo was written by a reporter named Rich Reed, who had covered Japan and Asia for the paper for some time. The idea was really intriguing, but at the same time, really confusing. I remember my reaction being sort of potatoes, French fries, Asia, McDonald's, because of course the potatoes were going to be McDonald's French fries. And how does this all hold together? What does it really mean? Clearly it was a big idea, and ours was a newsroom where big ideas could fly, or in this case, fry. But more on that in a moment. As a senior editor in a newsroom, I have many jobs and responsibilities, but there's nothing more rewarding than listening to fellow journalists telling me stories about stories they want to report and write. Reporters and their editors get excited, passionate, even angry when they get behind an idea that could change lives, expose wrongdoing, and make a difference. My job is to help refine the ideas, help think through what can and cannot be done, and then clear the runway so the work can take off. I've really been most fortunate and blessed to have helped lead newsrooms that have won 10 Pulitzer Prizes, including the Heroin Project you heard about earlier this evening from Terry. But back to French fries. Initially, the proposal didn't get a lot of traction, but Rich was persistent, as good reporters are, and wrote a second memo, which led to more conversations, which led to an editor named Therese Bottomley, who's now the editor of the Oregonian, getting involved in advocating for Rich and eventually getting the project approved. A key decision along the way was to pair Rich with a guy named Jack Hart, who at the time, and in my mind still is, the best coach and teacher of narrative writing that our industry has seen. Jack really helped Rich see the complexity of what he was taking on and the need to make it accessible to readers. Economics, after all, as many of you remember from college, does not exactly make for a great read. Plus, there was another problem. Most great narratives, like the story of Celine that you just heard, have a central character. As Jack told Rich, his central character was an inanimate object, a potato. Not exactly the stuff of great literature. But together they crafted an amazing series of stories that followed the potatoes from the fields of Eastern Washington State to being blessed by Muslim clerics because the potatoes were originally ticketed for Indonesia, to be trucked across the state to the port of Tacoma, loaded onto a ship, and eventually ending up in Singapore because of turmoil that was occurring then in Indonesia as the regime of Suharto fell apart. It worked because every scene had a point, another Jack Hart teaching. And it worked because Rich was there to put it into context. What could have been dry economic report became the richest of narratives by Rich, with incredible anecdotes, scene setting, and explanation. Let me just read very briefly an excerpt from the French Fry Connection that gives you a sense of how this worked. Rich wrote, "Following 20 tons of potatoes halfway around the world is a whimsical pursuit. A French fry is an incidental item, a ketchup-drenched side dish in fast food's global glut," which is really hard to say. Yet fries are also a $2 billion Northwest industry, a study of mass production and global competition, and an uncanny barometer of economic health. The fate of one particular load of French fries and the lives and cultures of those who handle it illuminates the causes and effect of Asia's anguish the way no economic treatise ever could. The lowly Spud provides an improbable window on these events. The French Fry Connection was published in October 1998. It won the Pulitzer for explanatory reading the next year. And French fries really is the ultimate in explanatory reporting. It tied together regions of the world. It showed how economies intersect. And it did so with a smart back and forth of anecdote and economics. It's why I still hear from friends today in the academic journalism world regularly on how they still use Rich's work as a teaching tool, now more than 20 years after publication. It's just a great reminder that the power of a great idea is enduring. And one of the reasons journalism remains so important is that it allows ideas for stories, moments of curiosity, a feeling that something may just not be quite right to eventually become incredible storytelling. Now, let me just tell you about another memorable story. Tom Holman Jr. is one of journalism's most celebrated feature writers and storytellers. He won the Pulitzer in Portland in 2001 for feature writing for a series called The Boy Behind the Mask, which documented the struggles of a teenage boy who was born with a significant facial deformity. Holman's work is so good that, as my friend and former editor of the Oregonian, Sandy Rowe, who was editor during those Pulitzer times, liked to say, and it's a phrase I still use regularly, sometimes the best thing you can do as an editor is applaud and get out of the way, which we did. We let Tom, and again, Jack Hart, weave their tapestry. One of the most powerful memories of the work to this day is when we spread out all the photos on a conference table and saw Sam Leitner, the story's subject, from every angle, in his home, and in Boston for difficult surgeries that he underwent. It's the case, like is the case for all of us speaking here tonight, it's a reminder of why we do what we do. Here's a little excerpt from Tom's story. And it's a little hard to listen to, so I forgive me for if it hits you the wrong way, but it's quite powerful. A huge mass of flesh balloons out from the left side of his face. His left ear, the color of eggplant, bulges from the side of his head like misshapen hamburger. His chin juts forward. The main body of tissue, laced with blue veins, swells in a dome that runs from sideburn level to chin. The mass draws his left eye into a slit, warps his mouth into a small inverted half moon. It looks as though someone has slapped 3 pounds of wet clay onto his face, where it clings, burying the boy inside. But Sam, the boy behind the mask, peers out from the right eye. It is clear, perfectly formed, and a deep, penetrating brown. Sam looks directly into the faces of other human beings with his one good eye. Tom told Sam's story, that of a 14-year-old boy just trying to fit in, with compassion and tenderness and beautiful, simple writing. He saw so much, including a radical surgery to try to remove the mass from the side of Sam's head that in the end was only moderately successful. His reporting from a hospital operating room in Boston would be the envy of any TV doctor show. But there's one anecdote that was profoundly moving for me about this work. After the announcement of Tom's Pulitzer, we celebrated at a downtown Portland restaurant. Sam's parents joined us. I remember Tom telling me how stunned they were when the story first came out. You know, real people don't understand the power of the newspaper page or the power of being the subject of a story. They went out to buy a paper and were completely flummoxed to see their boy's photo taking up most of the Oregonian's Sunday front page. But at the night of that party, they were gracious, generous, and so grateful for Tom's work and the paper's willingness to tell their son's story. They were normal, down-to-earth people, someone you might meet at a school open house. And I couldn't say thank you enough to them for letting us into their lives. I think I teared up a little bit talking to them, but I can get emotional about stories and about winning Pulitzers. But you know, I've worked with some of the best people on the planet, and I do today in Detroit. We keep learning, we keep striving, we keep trying to make a difference. Rewards like the Pulitzer are a wonderful affirmation of what we do, but it's the journalistic journey that matters most. It's the stories, it's the readers, it's the impact. I mean, after all, French fries? Really? Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much for your journalism and for name checking so many people, lifting so many people up. But it's true, you lifted so many people up in your career, and you did so again this evening. So thank you so much for talking with us.
Sure thing, Megan. Thank you.
Also, yeah, French fries, right? Like,
yeah, go figure.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one last sort of Q&A moment with you this evening. We'd like to welcome up our colleague, Joe Sonka. Joe is here on behalf of the Louisville Courier-Journal. He's our most recent Pulitzer winner. And I want to provide a little tiny bit of context. Hi, Joe. Thanks for being here.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
You might know the name of the Courier-Journal for any number of reasons, but mostly because they are the main newspaper of record urgently covering the Breonna Taylor case, and they have been literally since the start. And so Joe and that newsroom have been like actively covering just minute to minute everything about that case. But Joe is here to talk about something that happened in December that really changed the way, I mean, hopefully the people in Kentucky understand their state leadership. And so with that, Joe, your story was about the then governor of Kentucky and some truly jaw-dropping things he did on his way out. Kind of bring us briefly into the start of the story.
So it's common for governors at the end of their term to issue lots of pardons. They have that power under the Constitution that's unchecked. But Governor Matt Bevin, after he lost his re-election bid last November, in the days, in his final days before he left office in December, he was really unique in just how many norms he broke around pardons and commutations. One was the volume. In those final few days, he issued over 600 pardons, and these were not just low-level drug offenders who he was releasing out of overcrowded prisons. We're talking people who were recently convicted and sentenced for many years for extremely serious violent crimes, murders, we're talking sexual assault of children. And also people were totally caught off guard about this. Prosecutors weren't consulted, the family members of the victims weren't talked to. And in the case of one of our first stories, actually our first story, some of them came from politically connected families. There was one person sentenced to 19 years for shooting someone in a botched home invasion and robbery. Bevin pardoned this person, and his brother actually hosted a fundraiser at the governor's house a year earlier where he raised tens of thousands of dollars for his campaign. So you had prosecutors who were furious, you had the family members of victims who were furious, and even the Republican allies they had had for the past 4 years turned on them and criticized them. Called for law enforcement investigations, and eventually at the end of that month, after 3 weeks of stories, the new Republican Attorney General requested the FBI to investigate.
Holy cow. Joe, you said there were more than 600 pardons, which is like a mind-boggling number, but you said there was a lot more that was sort of mind-blowing about it. What to you was the most sort of like surprising aspect of this reporting?
I think the most surprising aspect is the information that Bevin was using to issue these pardons and commutations. After our first 3 stories, the first 3 days of really hard-hitting stories, Governor Bevin called me out of the blue and talked to me for nearly an hour, defending these pardons, some of the most controversial pardons, saying that these people were actually innocent. He was righting a wrong. The suggested there was corruption in law enforcement and the prosecutors. And he ended the call with a challenge saying, if you really dig into this, you can win a Pulitzer Prize. He added that he didn't know if I write or research well enough to win it, but someone could. Well, we didn't need him.
Turns out.
Turns out we didn't need him to make that challenge. We were going to do that anyway. And our editor, Rick Green, basically deputized half our newsroom, and we dug into it. And we found that Bevan just had fundamental facts of the case totally wrong. And it really drew into question how he was making these decisions, who he was listening to, because he wasn't getting the same information or didn't have the same information as the juries that convicted them.
My gosh, no. I mean, Joe, we have to go, we have to wrap up our show, but I really want to thank you and underline this. Joe's reporting is not done, right? There's still tons of fallout with these 600 pardons. So this is still an active story. So I'll give you just a second as we kind of wrap up here, but what's next for you guys with this?
Yeah, well, the FBI really isn't talking about what they are doing or aren't doing, but we're still finding new information about the pardons over the summer. One person that Bevan commuted was federally indicted for his crime against a child. A top advisor to the Attorney General resigned days after our stories that he had advised the governor to make two of his most controversial pardons. And there's also a voter referendum on the ballot this fall which would amend our Constitution to say that a governor issuing pardons has to notify prosecutors and family in advance. But we're doing that while we look into the COVID-19, while we look into the Breonna Taylor case, which has become one of the biggest stories in the country. So even though we're not all in the newsroom together, we're still working together as a team and juggling and chasing down important stories like that.
Joe, thank you so much for your journalism, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Megan.
Excellent. I'd like to bring up all of our storytellers this evening, along with Kristen. And so let everybody say thank you so much, colleagues, for being on our show this evening. It has been a joy to hear your stories. Everyone's going to wave from where they are. And our ML is going to take a victory lap. Thank you guys so much for being here. To our audience, thank you so much for caring about our journalism, joining us on this show. We'll be back, I think, in 2 weeks to bring you more true first-person stories from across America to create empathy and understanding. We appreciate your time.